Доброго дня, шановні глядачі.
Good afternoon, our audience. We start our activities today, and I'm announcing the start of the press conference of OHCHR, their thematic report. I would like to give the floor to Matilda Bogner, the head of the monitoring mission on human rights.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those present here today and those joining us online. Today we are launching our second thematic report on civic space and fundamental freedoms, which covers the period from the 1st of November 2019 to the 31st of October 2021. In territory controlled by the government, territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics in Lugansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, currently occupied by the Russian Federation. The report is based on information collected by OHCHR through interviews with victims and witnesses of human rights violations, direct observation, including trial and assembly monitoring, analysis of corroborating information confidentially shared with OHCHR, official records, including court documents, open source documents and video, photo and audio materials, and other relevant and reliable data. Our office is concerned about restrictions on the free expression of critical and unpopular opinions, on participation in peaceful assemblies, on sensitive topics, and safety of human rights defenders in Ukraine. During the reporting period, political and legislative developments in government-controlled territory resulted in restrictions on civic space. The attacks against opposition political parties, their members and staff increased before and after the 2020 local elections, negatively affecting the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association, and the right to participate. Similarly, in January and February 2021, a wave of threats, intimidation, property damage, and in one case, physical violence, followed the entry into force of amendments to the state language legislation in the service sector, targeting those who criticized these measures. Government sanctions that led to the closure of television channels and online media outlets were not in line with international law on freedom of expression and have limited public access to information and undermined critical journalism. Of particular concern in government-controlled territory is the lack of accountability for perpetrators who resort to violence and threats targeting human rights defenders, media workers, and individuals who express opinions online or attempt to participate in policy making. The authorities' failure in most cases to protect members of civil society from attacks and to hold the perpetrators accountable contributes to an environment in which there is self-censorship, a narrowing of civic space, and curtailment of pluralism. OHCHR documented 29 incidents targeting journalists, media professionals, bloggers, and individuals expressing opinions critical of the authorities or government policies. In 22 of these cases, perpetrators resorted to violence, while other cases involved threats, incitement to violence, online smear campaigns, and intentional damage to property. The attacks that OHCHR recorded in 2020 and 2021 mainly targeted investigative journalists and media workers covering political topics such as corruption and implementation of COVID-19 restrictions. There were also attacks against individuals expressing opinions on political matters or criticizing mainstream narratives. In most cases, perpetrators were not held to account, contributing to a sense of impunity and fueling further attacks. While we recognize that the government has made some efforts to improve the situation, more efforts are needed in order to ensure justice. Turning to the issue of human rights defenders, During the reporting period, OHCHR documented 14 incidents, including attacks, threats, and intimidation, targeting 18 human rights defenders, including 10 women and 8 men, who work on women's rights, gender equality, LGBTI rights, anti-corruption, and environmental issues, particularly those in the regions. In only one of these incidents, the authorities identified and prosecuted the perpetrators. The lack of accountability for such attacks discourages participation in public affairs and civic activism. In relation to peaceful assemblies, we have seen improved security of large LGBTI assemblies in big cities. At the same time, concerns remain regarding securing smaller assemblies and assemblies on other sensitive issues. We documented 21 attacks against peaceful assemblies. Most of the targeted assemblies were organised by the LGBTI community, women human rights defenders, and opposition political parties. 15 of these attacks were perpetrated by groups that promote violence or their alleged affiliates, usually with impunity. In at least 10 cases, by the end of the reporting period, law enforcement authorities had refused to initiate criminal proceedings. At times, law enforcement agencies have failed to immediately intervene to stop violence when they have been present and to initiate investigations. In a number of documented cases, perpetrators did not hide their affiliation with groups that promote violence. Yet, during the investigation, the National Police failed to identify them. In territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, civic space and fundamental freedoms were severely restricted as soon as armed groups took control in 2014, leading to an erosion of space for free expression and independent activism and increased self-censorship. Since then, OHCHR has continued to observe a further narrowing of civic space in the territory. Both self-proclaimed republics amended their so-called administrative and criminal codes in order to curb critical opinions, including those expressed online, and restrict participation in public affairs. For example, in April 2021, a provision was added to the so-called Criminal Code of Donetsk People's Republic, prescribing a criminal punishment of up to 2 years in prison for slander committed publicly and on social networks. Similarly, the so-called People's Council of the Lugansk People's Republic in December 2019 expanded its lists of administrative offences to include dissemination of information, including online, that offends human dignity or public morals and explicitly disrespects authorities. Both self-proclaimed republics also arbitrarily detained or threatened to detain social media users for expressing their views online and individuals who participated in peaceful assemblies, critical of decision-making in the self-proclaimed republics. We documented 10 cases where individuals were prosecuted for expressing their opinions, in particular pro-Ukrainian views, for participating in public affairs, and in one case for seeking remedy for violation of their rights. Social media content was censored, and social media accounts with views critical of the self-proclaimed republics were shut down. Decisions of the courts in the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic view critical opinions as a threat to the authorities and to the constitutional order. In November 2019, the so-called Ministry of State Security of Lugansk People's Republic detained an entrepreneur from Lugansk for publicly expressing his pro-Ukrainian views. He was held incommunicado for 3 days and later sentenced to 13.5 years in prison for high treason. Many human rights defenders left the territory controlled by the armed groups after the start of the armed conflict in 2014, having faced reprisal for their work. Those who have remained and continued their work experience a high degree of insecurity. In particular, women human rights defenders working to support domestic violence survivors. Nevertheless, some of them still continue their activities, often keeping a low profile due to fear of persecution, such as criminal liability for accepting funds from Ukrainian or international organizations. Freedom of peaceful assembly remains highly restricted in both self-proclaimed republics. OHCHR did not observe any assemblies on sensitive political issues in either of the self-proclaimed republics. This is likely due to the prevailing atmosphere of fear of persecution for speaking out and self-censorship. Assemblies raising issues of economic and social rights, such as labour strikes, took place, but their organisers and participants faced serious consequences, including arbitrary detention. There is little space for free expression and assembly in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics. Punishing people for expressing opinions and participating in policy discussions that affect their safety and well-being is contrary to international human rights law. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, we continue to document violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law and to make recommendations to remedy these to the Russian Federation as an occupying power. The situation in Crimea continued to be marked by restrictions on freedom of expression, particularly in relation to opinions critical of Russian Federation policies and practices on the peninsula. Journalists who expressed dissenting or critical views of the authorities were subjected to surveillance, criminal prosecution, arrests, prohibition of entry into Crimea, and deportation from Crimea. In an emblematic case, the editor-in-chief of the Crimea Tatar newspaper Kirim was fined for abuse of freedom of mass information for publishing the United Nations Secretary General's 2020 report on the human rights situation in Crimea. Aside from journalists, human rights defenders also operated in a highly constrained environment, running the risk of prosecution and other retaliation from the authorities. OHCHR is particularly concerned about cases of harassment of lawyers, defending clients in high-profile cases, and subjecting them to administrative sanctions, negatively affecting the proper discharge of their professional duties. Lawyers should be able to perform all their professional functions without intimidation, hindrance, harassment, or arbitrary interference. The expression of dissenting political or alternative views through participation in public assemblies continued to be curtailed in Crimea. In particular, freedom of peaceful assembly was undermined by the blanket obligation to seek prior authorization from the occupation authorities before holding an assembly or face prosecution. In addition, law enforcement agencies routinely issued written warnings to stop potential participants from joining assemblies. Freedom of association was also subject to unjustified and disproportionate restrictions. Groups and associations perceived as opposing the occupation of Crimea or Russian Federation policies, such as the Medjlis and Crimean Solidarity, came under scrutiny by law enforcement authorities and faced interference with their activities. During the reporting period, leaders of the Crimean Tatar community with strong affiliations to the Medjlis faced prosecution in Crimea, and the Medjlis itself continues to be labelled as an extremist organisation, despite the 2017 order of the International Court of Justice, which requested the Russian Federation to refrain from imposing such limitations. Separately, members of the civic group Crimean Solidarity complained to OHCHR of threats and pressure by law enforcement authorities on landlords to refuse to rent facilities to Crimean Solidarity to conduct meetings. This report offers concrete, practical, and fact-based recommendations for improving the human rights situation through fostering civic space, promoting fundamental freedoms, and enhancing inclusive working conditions and meaningful participation for all civil society actors everywhere in Ukraine. Our key recommendations to state and local authorities call on them to promptly and publicly condemn all instances of violence, incitement to violence, and discrimination and hate speech. We also call on law enforcement agencies to promptly and effectively investigate all such cases. Impunity for all types of violence is unacceptable. All perpetrators should be brought to account regardless of their possible affiliations with groups that promote violence or any other communities. We also recommend improvements to legislation, including criminalization of hate speech inciting discrimination, hostility, and violence, and specifying sexual orientation and gender identity as grounds of discrimination in relation to Article 161 of the Criminal Code on hate crimes. Armed groups in control of territory must respect international human rights standards when their conduct affects the human rights of individuals in their territory. OHCHR urges the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic to refrain from implementing regulations and practices that unduly restrict the exercise of freedom of expression and immediately release all individuals detained in relation to exercising their fundamental freedoms. In relation to Crimea, we reiterate our previous calls for the Russian Federation to uphold its obligations as a duty bearer under international human rights law in Crimea and respect its obligations as an occupying power pursuant to international humanitarian law. We urge the Russian Federation to cease applying provisions on extremism, terrorism, and separatism to penalize free speech and peaceful conduct. We also urge the Russian Federation to promote a safe and enabling environment for independent and diverse civil society organizations. In conclusion, I call on all duty bearers to implement these recommendations and assure them that as OHCHR in Ukraine, we stand ready to assist them in these efforts. Thank you.
Дуже дякую за
Thank you very much for your report. Do we have any questions? We don't. Thank you.
Вопросов нету, да?